You know, life has a funny way of sneaking up on you when you least expect it. I thought I had everything figured out. A great job, a decent house in the suburbs, and a wife I adored. Her name's Laura. She's the kind of woman who lights up a room just by walking into it. And for the longest time, I believed she only lit up for me. We had a good thing going, or at least, that's what I told myself, what I desperately wanted to believe even as the ground beneath me began to subtly shift. It all started, innocuously enough, when Laura decided to get serious about fitness. Not that she needed it, mind you. To me, she was already perfect. The gentle curve of her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed, the comfortable way we fit together on the couch after a long day. But she had this way of looking at herself in the mirror, a critical gaze that scanned for flaws I couldn't see, like she saw something I couldn't, or perhaps something she didn't want me to see anymore. It was a new habit, this prolonged scrutiny, and it pricked at my sense of security, though I wouldn't admit it, not even to myself. One day, out of the blue, she announced she'd hired a personal trainer. "I want to take my workouts to the next level," she'd said, her voice brimming with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard in a while, at least not directed towards anything involving us. "Sure, why not?" I'd replied, forcing a supportive smile. If it made her happy, I wasn't going to stand in her way. How could I? What right did I have to question her pursuit of self-improvement, even if a tiny, selfish part of me wondered why she suddenly felt the need for such drastic improvement? Enter Brent. Yeah, Brent. The name alone makes my skin crawl now, a visceral reaction that tightens my chest and clenches my jaw. But back then I didn't think much of it. He was, in retrospect, everything you'd expect from a guy in his line of work. Tall, broad shoulders that seemed to test the limits of any fabric, muscles that strained against every piece of clothing he wore. He had that arrogant smirk plastered on his face, the kind that suggested he knew something you didn't, that he held some secret key to a world you weren't privy to. It was a look that, I would later realize, was probably his primary tool of manipulation. At first, I laughed it off. The guy's just doing his job, I told myself, trying to quiet the nascent unease. She's just motivated. But then, things started to shift. It was subtle at first, like the tide slowly receding, leaving more and more of the beach exposed. Laura started spending more time at the gym. An extra hour here, an early morning session there, carving out chunks of time that used to be ours. She'd come home flushed and glowing, her hair damp, her eyes sparkling with a kind of exhilaration that I, admittedly, hadn't seen in her for a while. She'd talk endlessly about how Brent had pushed her limits, how he'd helped her smash her personal bests, how he'd just understood her fitness goals. It sounded innocent enough, the kind of professional enthusiasm one might expect. But the way she said his name, Brent this, Brent that, it was like he'd become a permanent fixture in our conversations, an invisible third person in our marriage. The cadence of her voice when she mentioned him had a lilt, a brightness, that was usually reserved for exciting news or a shared private joke. I shrugged it off, or tried to. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was just being sensitive. I mean, I'm not the jealous type, or at least, I didn't think I was. I'd always prided myself on being secure, trusting. But then I caught her texting late at night, the screen's glow illuminating her face in the darkened bedroom. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a small, almost secretive smile playing on her lips. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though a knot of anxiety was already forming in my stomach. She glanced up, her smile faltering for a microsecond before she composed herself. "Oh, just Brent," she said, a little too casually. "He's sending me tips for my workout tomorrow. You know, meal prep ideas, stretches. Tips for her workout? At 11 o'clock at night?" A cold dread seeped into me. I didn't say anything at the time, didn't voice the suspicion that was coiling in my gut. What could I say? Accuse her? Sound like a possessive fool? But something didn't sit right with me. It felt off. You see, I wanted to trust her. God, I wanted to believe that everything was just as it always had been, that we were still the same couple who laughed over burnt pancakes on Sunday mornings and danced in the kitchen to old Motown records. The couple who could communicate with a single look. But the more Brent's name came up, the more his spectral presence filled our home, the more I felt like a stranger in my own marriage, an outsider looking in. Looking back, maybe I should have said something sooner. Maybe I should have asked why. Why she was so eager to transform herself. Why she suddenly needed someone like Brent in her life to validate her, to push her. But I didn't. Instead, I buried my doubts deep down, played along, hoping, praying, it was all in my head. After all, Laura was my wife. And in marriage, you're supposed to trust your partner, right? Right? You know that old saying about how cracks in the foundation eventually bring the whole house down? At the time, I didn't even notice the cracks forming in my marriage, or perhaps I willfully ignored them. They were so small, so seemingly insignificant, that I brushed them off as normal wear and tear, the kind of minor stresses any long-term relationship endures. But looking back, with the painful clarity of hindsight, it's clear they were there, and they were growing, spider-webbing through the very bedrock of what I thought was our unbreakable bond. The distance was subtle, insidious. Laura was still there, physically. She made dinner, though her movements in the kitchen seemed more mechanical, less joyful. She sat on the couch with me in the evenings, but the comfortable silence we once shared now felt charged, heavy with unspoken things. We shared a bed, but a chasm seemed to have opened between our sides, an invisible barrier that made even accidental touches feel awkward. Emotionally, it felt like she was a million miles away, orbiting a different star. Conversations that used to flow so easily, bubbling with shared jokes and genuine interest, now felt forced, stilted. She'd laugh, a bright, genuine laugh, at something Brent had apparently said during their session, a story she'd relay with animated detail. But when I tried to crack a joke, something that would have had her giggling uncontrollably a year ago, she'd offer a polite, fleeting smile, her eyes already drifting back to her phone. I'd ask how her day was, and she'd give me a quick, fine, before burying her nose in her phone, scrolling, tapping, a faint smile occasionally gracing her lips. And oh, the phone. I started noticing how attached she'd become to it, a veritable extension of her hand. She'd keep it on her at all times, clutching it like it held the secrets of the universe, or at least, secrets from me. I'd glance over her shoulder, trying to be nonchalant, and see her texting, that same faint smile playing on her lips. When I'd summoned the courage to ask who it was, bracing myself for the inevitable, the answer was always the same, delivered with an air of slight impatience, as if I were being intrusive. Brent. He's just checking in on my progress. Progress? I'd mutter under my breath after she'd turned away. My ass. What kind of trainer needs to check in at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday? But I never said it loud enough for her to hear. I didn't want to seem paranoid, truly. I told myself I was being irrational, insecure, even a little pathetic. This was Laura, my Laura. She couldn't. But then there were the little things, the tiny, discordant notes in the symphony of our life, the ones that didn't add up, no matter how I tried to arrange them. She started buying new workout clothes, tight leggings and vibrant patterns, low-cut tops that hugged her changing physique, all of it designed to show off her figure. She'd preen in front of the mirror, turning this way and that. "Do you like it?" she'd ask, and when I said, "Yes, you look amazing," she'd smile, but it never felt like the smile was for me. It felt like she was rehearsing for a different audience. There were other moments too, moments that chipped away at my peace of mind, like tiny hammers on glass. Like the time I found a gym receipt tucked into her purse for a protein smoothie, one she'd never mentioned, one with 2 straws indicated on the bill. Or the time she came home from a supposed late-night gym session smelling faintly of a perfume she usually reserved for special occasions. Perfume? To the gym? I mean, come on, who does that? Unless the gym wasn't the only stop. I wanted to confront her, to lay all my suspicions out, to ask her outright what the hell was going on, to demand answers. But I didn't. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that I was overreacting, that my insecurity was painting innocent actions with a sinister brush. After all, I didn't want to be that guy, the controlling husband who polices his wife's every move, questioning her friendships, her choices. That wasn't me. But the truth was, I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know how to handle the growing, acidic pit in my stomach, or the constant, nagging hum of doubt in my mind. I started to feel like I was competing with Brent, this phantom competitor who seemed to embody everything I wasn't, or perhaps, everything I had ceased to be in her eyes. He was fit, confident, and apparently available at all hours to support Laura, to push her. How was I supposed to measure up to that? One night, long after Laura had gone to bed, claiming exhaustion from an intense workout, I found myself scrolling through her Instagram. She hadn't been particularly active on it before, but recently it had become another avenue for her newfound fitness persona. And there it was, a gym selfie, Laura glowing, slightly sweaty, a triumphant look on her face. The caption read, "Feeling stronger every day? Flexed biceps, thanks for the killer motivation. At Brent the Beast Fitness. My jaw clenched. So, Brent the Beast Fitness had a name now, not just in our strained conversations, but in her public life, a public declaration of his influence. It was as if he was methodically taking up space in our marriage, pushing me further and further to the periphery, and I wasn't even sure if Laura noticed or cared. The cracks were there, undeniable now, and I could feel them widening, threatening to swallow me whole. I just didn't know what to do about it. Do you confront the person you love, the person you've built your life with, and risk being labeled paranoid, jealous, accusatory, potentially shattering the fragile peace that remains? Or do you stay quiet, grit your teeth, and hope the storm passes, hope that this is just a phase? At the time, I chose the latter. I stayed quiet, hoping against hope that things would magically go back to normal. But let me tell you something, cracks don't heal themselves. They only get worse. And boy, was I about to find out just how bad they could get. I've always thought of myself as a reasonable man, the kind of guy who avoids unnecessary drama, who prefers quiet resolution to loud confrontation. But there's something about watching another man, a smirk-wearing, muscle-bound caricature, invade your marriage, your sanctuary, your life, that stirs something primal inside you, something you didn't even know existed. And for me, that moment of primal clarity, that snap, came the day I met Brent face to face. I hadn't planned to visit the gym that afternoon. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, one of those good instincts you can't quite explain but feel compelled to follow. Laura had left a few hours earlier for her usual session, her gym bag slung over her shoulder, a quick, distracted peck on my cheek her only goodbye. I was working from home, staring blankly at my laptop screen, the words blurring together, my mind replaying the same loop of suspicion and anxiety. Suddenly, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I'd swing by, surprise her. Maybe grab a coffee afterward, try to reconnect a little, bridge the ever-widening gap between us. It was innocent enough, or at least, that's what I told myself as I grabbed my keys. When I walked through the glass doors of Peak Performance Fitness, a name that now sounds like a sick joke, I was hit by the familiar smell of rubber mats, stale sweat, and cleaning chemicals. A symphony of clanging weights, the rhythmic whir of treadmills, and pulsing, generic dance music filled the air. I scanned the brightly lit, mirror-lined room for Laura, my heart thudding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. And there she was, standing by the free weights section with Brent. He towered over her, his broad shoulders and ridiculously defined biceps practically glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. He was leaning in close, too close, his head angled towards hers, and they were laughing at something she'd said, a shared intimacy in their posture that sent a jolt of pure, undiluted jealousy through me. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, hard and cold. But I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe. This was her trainer, her professional trainer. There could be a perfectly innocent explanation, right? But as I watched him place his hand on her lower back, ostensibly to adjust her posture, as she performed a squat, his fingers splaying a little too familiarly, a little too long, I felt that knot turn into a full-blown, twisting serpent of anger. His touch lingered. Her responding smile was unguarded, almost grateful. I approached them, forcing a smile onto my face, a brittle facade of casualness. "Hey, Laura," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly steady. She turned, startled, her eyes widening as if I'd caught her doing something she wasn't supposed to. A flush rose on her cheeks. "Oh, hey, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a little too high-pitched, a little too nervous. Brent turned his head slowly, giving me a deliberate, leisurely once-over, from my slightly too sensible shoes to my decidedly not gym-toned physique. Then he smirked. That smirk. God, I hated it. It was condescending, dismissive, proprietary. "Thought I'd surprise you," I said, keeping my tone light, though my gaze was fixed on Brent. I turned to him, extending a hand I didn't want to offer. "And you must be Brent." He took my hand, his grip firm, almost crushing, and definitely held a second too long. "A power play." "That's me," he said, his voice dripping with a smug confidence that grated on my nerves. "Laura talks about you all the time." "Funny," I replied, letting a sharp edge creep into my voice, my smile tightening. "She talks about you a lot too, Brent." Brent chuckled, a low, rumbling sound, clearly not picking up on, or, more likely, choosing to ignore, the palpable hostility radiating from me. "Well, that's because we're making great progress. Laura's been absolutely killing it in here." He turned to her, flashing that toothy, predatory grin again. "Isn't that right?" Champ? Champ. I repeated, my voice sharp enough to cut glass, the forced politeness shattering. You always talk to your clients like that, Brent? Or is Laura getting the special VIP treatment? Brent's grin faltered for a split second, his eyes narrowing slightly before he recovered, his arrogance reasserting itself like a shield. Look, man, he said, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, though his tone was anything but conciliatory. I'm just doing my job. If you've got a problem, maybe you should hit the weights yourself instead of. That's when I saw red. He didn't get to mock me, not in front of Laura, not in my presence, not after weeks of this emotional torment. I stepped closer, invading his personal space, my voice low and controlled, vibrating with suppressed fury. Instead of what, Brent? I asked, daring him, almost hoping he would finish his sentence. Brent leaned back slightly, clearly enjoying himself, relishing the confrontation. He probably thought I was some jealous weakling he could easily swat away. Instead of standing there looking like a guy who's clearly out of his league, he said, the smirk firmly back in place, more pronounced than ever. Out of my league. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I wasn't just mad at Brent anymore. I was furious at the whole damn situation. Furious at Laura for letting this peacock, this charlatan, act like he was some integral part of our marriage. Furious at myself for feeling so powerless for so long, for not addressing the cracks in our relationship sooner, for letting my fear and doubt fester. I took another step forward, getting right into Brent's face. His cologne, some cheap, musky scent, filled my nostrils, making me want to gag. Listen, Brent, I said, my voice steady but vibrating with an intensity that surprised even me. I'm not here to play games. You stay professional, you do your job, and you keep your hands and your champ talk to yourself. Or this won't end well for you. Brent didn't flinch. Instead, he crossed his thick arms over his chest and smiled, a slow, deliberate smile, as if he found the whole thing deeply amusing. Relax, man, he said, his voice condescending. No need to get so worked up. Laura's a grown woman. She can make her own choices. And there it was. The smug little jab, the thinly veiled insinuation that she was making choices that involved him, choices that excluded me. It sent my anger into overdrive. I clenched my fists, feeling the tension ripple through my entire body, my knuckles white. I could feel the blood pounding in my temples. But I stopped myself. Not here. A small, rational part of my brain screamed. Not now. Instead, I turned to Laura, who had been watching this exchange with wide, horrified eyes, her face pale. We're leaving, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument, no possibility of negotiation. Laura hesitated for a heartbeat, her gaze flickering from me to Brent and back again, as if weighing her options. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly. Okay, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. As we walked out of the gym, the silence between us thick and suffocating, I could feel Brent's eyes on my back, his smug confidence practically burning a hole through me. He thought he'd won. He thought his muscles and his charm and his carefully cultivated alpha male persona made him untouchable. He had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that he'd just poked a bear that had been hibernating for far too long. You know, there's a moment in every man's life, I think, when the unvarnished, brutal truth slaps him so hard across the face it leaves a permanent mark, a stinging welt on his soul. Mine came one cool Tuesday evening, an evening I now replay in my mind like a recurring nightmare, when I followed Laura. I didn't plan it, not meticulously anyway. It wasn't some grand, cloak and dagger scheme cooked up in a fit of jealous rage. It was just pure, raw instinct, that persistent, gnawing feeling in your gut that whispers, then shouts, that something isn't right, something is terribly, horribly wrong. Laura had told me she was heading to the gym again. Late, as usual. Brent's offering a special evening session, she'd explained, her eyes avoiding mine, to really focus on toning my core. Her excuses were becoming more elaborate, yet somehow less believable. I didn't question it out loud. I'd stopped doing that, mostly, because it always ended the same way. Her brushing off my concerns with feigned innocence or a flash of irritation, making me feel like the unreasonable one. But this time, as she kissed me goodbye, a quick, almost obligatory peck on the cheek, I decided I had to see for myself. I couldn't live with the not knowing anymore. I waited until she pulled out of the driveway, her taillights disappearing around the corner. Then, hard hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, I grabbed my keys and headed out, slipping into my own car a few minutes later. I kept my distance, making sure to stay a couple of cars behind her, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I kept telling myself, this is stupid. You're being paranoid. She's going to the gym, and you're going to feel like an absolute idiot. The jealous fool she probably already thinks you are. But I couldn't shake the feeling, the cold tendril of dread that had wrapped itself around my spine. When Laura's car turned off the main road, my stomach lurched. This wasn't the way to peak performance fitness. Instead, she pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of a small, upscale Italian restaurant, Serafina's, a place we'd once talked about trying for a special occasion, but never had. My breath caught in my throat. I parked a few spots away, hidden in the shadows, and watched as she got out of her car. She wasn't wearing her gym clothes. She was wearing a new dress, a sleek, dark blue number I'd never seen before, one that hugged her curves. She smoothed her hair, adjusted the strap of her purse, and took a deep breath before walking inside. The dress she swore she bought for casual dinners with friends. Friends I never met, dinners I was never invited to. For a moment, a sliver of desperate hope pierced through me. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was meeting a girlfriend, a colleague. Maybe I was overthinking everything. But then, I saw him. Brent. He strode into the restaurant like he owned the place, dressed not in gym gear but in a tight-fitting shirt and dark jeans, wearing that same cocky, self-satisfied grin I'd grown to despise with every fiber of my being. My stomach didn't just sink, it plummeted, taking all my remaining hope with it. This wasn't a special core toning session. This wasn't a casual dinner with a friend. This was a date. A clandestine meeting. A betrayal. I sat there for a few minutes, frozen, staring at the two of them through the restaurant window. They were seated at a cozy table near the back, bathed in the warm, intimate glow of a candle. Laura was laughing, leaning forward in her seat, her hand brushing his arm as she spoke. Brent was eating it up, flashing that toothy, predatory smile, hanging on her every word, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made my blood boil. It was like watching a movie you desperately didn't want to see, a horror film starring your own life, but you couldn't look away, transfixed by the awfulness of it. The betrayal hit me like a freight train, knocking the air from my lungs. It wasn't just that she was with another man. It was who that man was. Brent. The guy who'd made a mockery of me in my own marriage, in his damn gym. The guy who'd smirked and told me to hit the weights. And there he was, living out what I could only describe as his sleazy fantasy, while I sat outside in the cold, dark car like a fool, a cuckold. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes? Hours? Time felt like a blur, a thick, viscous fluid I was drowning in. At some point, I realized my hands were still gripping the steering wheel, so hard that my knuckles were bone white, my palms aching. The anger was still there, a molten core of rage deep inside me, but it wasn't just anger anymore. It was pain. A deep, tearing, visceral pain that twisted in my gut and left me gasping for air, like I'd been sucker punched. I wanted to storm inside, flip their candlelit table, and drag Laura out of there by her arm. I wanted to scream, to rage, to break something. But I didn't. Not because I didn't want to, God knows I did, but because I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it wouldn't solve anything. It would only make me look like the jealous, unhinged husband and he, probably already thought I was. It would validate their narrative. So, I stayed in my car, stewing in a toxic brew of silence and fury, letting the betrayal seep into every pore, every cell of my being. Eventually, they emerged from the restaurant, laughing, his arm now casually slung around her shoulders. I watched, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest, as Brent walked Laura to her car. His hand slid down to her lower back, proprietary, possessive, just like it had been in the gym. She smiled up at him, a soft, intimate smile, and for a moment, a terrible, gut-wrenching moment, I saw the woman I fell in love with, the woman who used to look at me like that. Only now, that look wasn't meant for me. It was meant for him. He kissed her. It wasn't just a quick peck on the lips, either. It was slow, deliberate, lingering, like he wanted the whole damn world, or at least any poor bastard like me who might be watching, to know that she was his. My chest tightened, a band of ice constricting my lungs, and I had to look away, a wave of nausea washing over me. When I forced myself to look back, Laura was getting into her car, her face flushed. Brent watched her drive off, then turned and headed to his own car, looking as smug and self-satisfied as ever. I followed Laura home that night, keeping my distance, my mind a maelstrom of shock, anger, and a profound, devastating sadness. When she walked through our front door, she acted like nothing had happened. She gave me that same quick, distracted kiss on the cheek, mumbled something about being tired from her workout, and went straight to bed. I stood there in the dimly lit hallway, staring at her retreating figure, feeling like my entire world had just crumbled around me, reduced to dust and ashes. That was the night I knew. The night I stopped lying to myself, stopped making excuses for her, stopped clinging to the tattered remnants of hope. Laura wasn't mine anymore. Maybe she hadn't been for a while. But one thing was certain, crystal clear in the wreckage of my shattered heart. I wasn't going to let Brent win. Not this time. Not anymore. They say everyone has a breaking point, a definitive moment where you're no longer willing to tolerate the disrespect, the lies, the soul-crushing betrayal. For me, that moment had arrived, not with a bang, but with the sickeningly sweet image of that kiss under the dim glow of a restaurant parking lot. Enough was enough. I wasn't going to be the guy standing idly by, the quiet, wounded husband, while my wife and her smug, predatory trainer made an absolute fool of me. Not anymore. It had been a few agonizing days since I'd followed Laura to that restaurant, since I'd witnessed the irrefutable proof of her infidelity. I hadn't confronted her yet. I hadn't let on that I knew. I needed time to process the raw, gaping wound of it all, time to decide how I was going to handle this catastrophic mess. Part of me, the exhausted, heartbroken part, wanted to walk away, to pack a bag, leave a note, and just disappear without a word, without a scene. But another part of me, the part that was still seething with a righteous fury, the part that couldn't stomach the thought of Brent swaggering around, thinking he'd gotten away with this, knew I had to do something. I owed it to myself. The opportunity, or perhaps the provocation, came sooner than I expected. Laura was at work, or so she said. My trust in her word was, understandably, non-existent. I was at home, pacing the confines of our living room like a caged animal, trying to distract myself with anything but the grim reality of my situation. That's when my phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number, but the text message that followed was anything but. It was from Brent. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the man, I thought, as I opened it, my hand trembling slightly. Hey man, it read. Just wanted to clear the air. Things got a little heated at the gym. Let's meet up and talk. Gym parking lot, 6 p.m. Talk? Clear the air, the sheer arrogance of it, the gall, made my blood boil. He wanted to talk? After what he'd done, after I'd seen him with my wife? I stared at the screen, my vision blurring with rage, a dozen violent scenarios playing out in my head. I could ignore it, delete the message, pretend I never saw it. But what would that accomplish? He'd think I was too scared to face him, too weak. I could confront Laura instead, finally lay it all out. But deep down, I wasn't ready for that conversation, not yet. That would be a different kind of battle, one that required a different kind of strength. No, this was between Brent and me. It was time to end this twisted game he'd been playing, once and for all. He wanted to talk? Fine. We'd talk. At 5:45 p.m., I pulled into the nearly empty gym parking lot. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, ominous shadows. Brent was already there, leaning casually against his obnoxiously flashy sports car, the one he probably bought with the money he conned out of vulnerable clients. He looked like he didn't have a care in the world, sunglasses perched on his head, arms crossed over his chest, muscles on full display. He looked like he was posing for some cheap gym advertisement, the picture of unearned confidence. I parked a few spaces away and got out, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my resolve was like steel. Glad you came, he said, flashing that insufferable, condescending smirk. Figured it was time we talked. Man to man. Man to man. The phrase hit me like a slap in the face, a bitter irony. What kind of man deliberately sets out to steal another man's wife, then acts like he's doing him a favor by clearing the air? But I kept my cool, or at least, the outward appearance of it. For the moment. What do you want, Brent? I asked, my voice cold, flat, devoid of the storm raging inside me. He shrugged, a picture of nonchalance, as if this whole sordid affair was just a minor inconvenience for him. Look, I get it, he began, his tone infuriatingly patronizing. You're upset. But you've got to understand, Laura's, well, she's got needs, man. Needs you obviously weren't meeting. Maybe you should have thought about that before letting yourself go. There it was. The jab. The classic, blame the victim, alpha male bullshit. My fists clenched at my sides, my nails digging into my palms, but I didn't move. Not yet. I let him keep digging his own grave. I'm not trying to be a jerk, he continued, clearly believing he was doing me some sort of favor with his twisted insights. But maybe if you actually hit the weights once in a while, instead of sitting around feeling sorry for yourself, you'd. That's when I snapped. I didn't even think about it. There was no conscious decision, no weighing of consequences. 1 second I was standing there, listening to him spout his vile, arrogant nonsense, and the next, my fist connected with his jaw. The sound was satisfying, a solid, clean thwack that sent him stumbling back against his precious car, his sunglasses flying off his head. The smirk was wiped clean off his face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. You think this is a joke? I snarled, my voice shaking with a rage that had been simmering for months. You think you can waltz into my life, disrespect me, destroy my marriage, and then just walk away unscathed, like you've done nothing wrong? Brent straightened up, wiping a trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. His cocky grin was gone, replaced by a look of surprise, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of fear. Hey, man, chill out. Let's not do something we'll both regret, he said, holding up his hands, his voice suddenly lacking its earlier bravado. But I wasn't in the mood for negotiation for de-escalation. You've already done enough. I spat, stepping closer, my shadow falling over him. You had the audacity to text me, to invite me here, to mock me to my face, to pretend like you're the better man? Let me make one thing crystal clear. Brent, you're nothing. You're a parasite. Before he could respond, before he could formulate another pathetic excuse, I hit him again. This time, a hard right to his ribs. He doubled over, gasping for air, the wind knocked out of him. And I didn't stop. Years of frustration, betrayal, humiliation, and a profound sense of loss came pouring out with every blow. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't heroic. It was raw, ugly, and fueled by a pain so deep it felt bottomless. By the time I stepped back, my knuckles aching, my breath coming in ragged gasps, Brent was on the ground, curled up, clutching his side, struggling to breathe. I stood over him, my chest heaving, and looked him dead in the eye. His face was a mess of blood and surprise. Stay away from me, I panted. Stay away from Laura. If I ever see you again, if I even hear your name mentioned in the same breath as hers, it won't end with just a few broken ribs. Do you understand me? He nodded weakly, his eyes wide with a fear he could no longer hide, too winded and too beaten to speak. I turned and walked away, leaving him there on the cold, unforgiving pavement, finally stripped of the smugness he wore like armor. For the first time in weeks and months, I felt a sliver of control, a tiny, fragile sense of empowerment. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, not entirely. Violence wasn't my nature. But God help me, I didn't regret it either. He had it coming. The drive home that night was silent, but it wasn't the strained, uncomfortable silence that had become the norm between Laura and me. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that feels heavy, oppressive, like the air itself is holding its breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. My knuckles still throbbed, a dull, persistent ache, a physical reminder of the line I'd crossed. The adrenaline that had coursed through my veins like liquid fire had started to ebb, leaving behind a strange, unsettling mix of exhaustion and a grim, hard-won clarity. I'd done it. I'd confronted him, put him in his place, taken back some semblance of control in a situation where I'd felt utterly powerless. But as I pulled into the driveway and cut the engine, staring at the darkened windows of the house we once called our sanctuary, a new, more daunting question gnawed at me. What now? Brent was dealt with, for now at least. But the real battle, the one that truly mattered, was still waiting for me inside that house. Laura was sitting on the couch when I walked in, her legs tucked under her, scrolling listlessly through her phone. The television was on, some mindless reality show flickering in the background, but she wasn't watching it. She looked up as I entered, offering me a small, tentative smile. Hey, you're home late, she said casually, as if nothing was wrong, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. I stood there for a moment, just inside the doorway, staring at her. How could she act so normal, so oblivious, when everything between us, everything we'd built, was falling apart, shattered into a million pieces? Yeah, I said, my voice clipped, curt. Had some things to take care of. She raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps unease, in her eyes, but she didn't press. Dinner's in the fridge, if you're hungry, she offered. Thanks, I muttered, heading towards the kitchen, more to avoid her gaze, to put some physical distance between us, than to actually grab food. I needed space, a moment to collect myself before I said something I couldn't take back, before the dam of my carefully constructed composure finally broke. As I leaned against the cool granite of the counter, the weight of it all, the betrayal, the fight, the devastating realization that the woman I'd built a life with, the woman I still, despite everything, loved, was slowly, inexorably slipping away from me. Hit me like a ton of bricks. I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself, but the thoughts, the questions, wouldn't stop. Was she thinking about Brent right now, even as she sat there feigning normalcy? Did she even care that I'd found out, that I knew about their sordid little affair? Did she feel any remorse, any guilt at all? I walked back into the living room, unable to hold it in any longer, the words clawing their way up my throat. "Laura," I said, my voice firmer than I expected, cutting through the drone of the television. She looked up, startled by the uncharacteristic sharpness in my tone. "We need to talk." Her brow furrowed, and she set her phone down on the cushion beside her, a subtle tension entering her posture. "Okay, what's going on?" she asked, her voice cautious. I sat down on the armchair across from her, my hands resting on my knees, my gaze unwavering. "I know about Brent," I said, watching her reaction closely, searching for any sign of truth, of remorse. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes, panic, maybe, or fear, but she quickly masked it with a confused, almost indignant expression. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a little too calm, a little too controlled. "I mean, I know about you and Brent," I said, my voice rising slightly, the anger I tried to suppress beginning to surface. "The dinners at Serafina's, the late-night texts, the way you light up when you talk about him, the kiss in the parking lot. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending nothing's going on." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. The color drained from her face. Finally, she sighed, a long, weary exhalation, and leaned back against the couch, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. It's not what you think," she said softly, her gaze dropping to her lap. "Then tell me what it is." I shot back, my voice cracking. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife has been sneaking around with her personal trainer behind my back, lying to me, betraying me, for months." Laura hesitated, her eyes darting away from mine, unable to meet my accusing stare. She picked at an invisible thread on her jeans. "Brent and we got close," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it wasn't." "Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand, the tremor in it betraying my inner turmoil. "Don't you dare try to minimize it. Close doesn't cover secret dinner dates and stolen kisses. Close doesn't explain the way you've been pulling away from me, from us, for months." Tears welled up in her eyes, big, fat tears that began to trace paths down her cheeks. But I couldn't tell if they were tears of guilt, of genuine remorse, or tears of frustration at being caught. "Of course it meant something," she said, her voice shaking, finally looking at me, her eyes pleading. "Us. You. But I didn't know how to talk to you about what I was feeling, about how disconnected I felt. It just happened." "It just happened?" I repeated, shaking my head in disbelief, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "That's your excuse? You felt disconnected, so you turned to some narcissistic, muscle-bound meathead trainer instead of your husband? Instead of talking to me?" She didn't answer, just looked down, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The silence that followed felt like a gaping chasm between us, cold and vast and impossible to bridge. I stood up, running a hand through my hair, feeling utterly drained, utterly broken. "I fought him, you know," I said, my voice quieter now, heavy with exhaustion. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock, fresh tears spilling over. "Brent? Tonight? You fought him?" "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Because he needed to know," I said, my voice hardening again. "He needed to know that what he did, what you did, has consequences. Because I couldn't stand the thought of him walking around, smirking, thinking he got the best of me, thinking he could just take what wasn't his without a fight." Laura covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she started to cry, deep, ragged sobs that filled the suffocating silence of the room. But I couldn't find it in myself to comfort her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The well of my compassion had run dry. "I don't know where we go from here, Laura," I said, my voice hollow, echoing the emptiness inside me. "I honestly don't. But something's got to change. Because I can't keep living like this. Not with the lies, the betrayal, the constant crushing silence. She didn't respond, didn't look up. And for the first time, I realized that maybe she didn't have an answer. Maybe there wasn't one. And maybe, just maybe, that was the hardest, most painful truth of all. The road ahead was shrouded in fog, and I had no map, no compass, only the wreckage of a love I thought would last a lifetime. The days following my confrontation with Laura felt like walking through a thick, disorienting, and utterly suffocating fog. The house, once a place of comfort and shared laughter, was eerily quiet, as if even the walls knew something profound and irreparable had shifted between us. We weren't shouting or arguing anymore. The explosive rawness of that initial confrontation had given way to a heavy, oppressive silence. Instead, we avoided each other, orbiting the same physical space like reluctant strangers who happened to share a roof, but nothing else. Meals were eaten separately, or in tense silence. Sleep, when it came, was fitful, separated by an invisible, unyielding wall down the middle of our bed. For the first time in years, probably since before I even met Laura, I had to confront a question I never thought I'd ask, a question that terrified me to my core. Who am I without Laura? Our lives had been so deeply, intricately intertwined for so long. Our friends, our routines, our hopes for the future, that I hadn't realized how much of my own identity I'd allowed to become submerged in us. But now, standing on the precipice of an uncertain, lonely future, I saw a glimmer of something else, something unexpected, an opportunity, however daunting, to find myself again, to rediscover the man I was before he became one half of a couple. I started small, tentatively. At first, it was just about filling the gaping hours that stretched before me, hours that used to be filled with the easy rhythm of our shared relationship. I picked up a book that had been gathering dust on the bedside table for years, one of those slightly pretentious literary novels Laura had always teased me about attempting. This time, I didn't care about her teasing. I needed something, anything, to make sense of the chaos I was feeling, or at least to distract me from it. The book led to podcasts, interviews with authors, deep dives into history, even some self-helpy stuff about resilience and navigating change. The podcasts, surprisingly, led to journaling. I bought a simple, unlined notebook and a good pen, and I started pouring out my thoughts, my anger, my confusion, my profound sadness, all the things I couldn't say to Laura, perhaps couldn't even fully articulate to myself until the ink hit the page. It was like opening a floodgate. Every emotion I'd been suppressing, every hurt, every bitter realization came rushing out. And for the first time in months, I felt a strange, almost imperceptible sense of relief, like a pressure valve being slowly released. Then came the gym. Not Brent's gym, of course. I couldn't stomach the idea of ever walking into that place again, of breathing the same air he did. Instead, I found a small, no-frills boxing gym across town, the kind of place with peeling paint, worn-out heavy bags, and the pervasive smell of old leather and honest sweat. It was gritty, unpretentious, and refreshingly devoid of mirrors and posers. Nobody there cared what you looked like, or how much weight you could lift, or what trendy brand of athletic wear you sported. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I was there for me. At first, it was awkward, humbling. I didn't know how to wrap my hands properly. My punches were clumsy and lacked power, and I was convinced everyone was secretly laughing at my pathetic attempts to look like I knew what I was doing. My muscles ached in places I didn't know existed. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. The heavy bag that had felt impossibly solid on day one now yielded slightly under my increasingly confident blows. The complex footwork drills started to feel less like a tangled mess and more like a dance. My reflection in the grimy window, I sometimes caught a glimpse of, started to change, not just physically, though I was definitely getting leaner, stronger, but emotionally. I saw a man who was trying, a man who was fighting back, not against another person, but against despair, against apathy. A man who was refusing to let his circumstances define him. The gym became my sanctuary, a place where I could channel my frustration, my anger, my grief, into something productive, something that left me exhausted but strangely exhilarated. With every drop of sweat, with every satisfying thud of glove against leather, I felt a little bit lighter, a little bit stronger, a little more whole. It wasn't about looking like Brent, or proving anything to Laura. It was about reclaiming a piece of myself, a sense of agency that I hadn't even realized I'd lost. Outside the gym, I started reconnecting with old friends, the ones I'd inadvertently drifted away from over the years, lost in the comfortable cocoon of marriage. They welcomed me back without hesitation, without judgment, offering a kind of easy camaraderie and unquestioning support I hadn't realized how much I'd missed. We grabbed beers, went to ball games, talked about everything and nothing. It reminded me that there was a world beyond my fractured marriage, a world full of different connections and possibilities, a world that had been waiting for me to step back into it. Laura noticed the changes. She didn't say much at first, but I could feel her watching me, her expression a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and perhaps a touch of something I couldn't quite decipher. Regret? Or maybe just surprise. She'd see me heading out with my gym bag, or coming home late after a night out with the guys. She'd comment on the books I was reading, the new intensity in my demeanor. I wasn't doing it for her, though. That was the biggest, most liberating revelation of all. For so long, I'd unconsciously measured my worth by her approval, by her happiness, by the reflection of myself I saw in her eyes. But now, for the first time in a long, long time, I was living for myself. My happiness, my well-being, was my own responsibility. One evening, she finally broke the tentative silence that had settled between us. "You've been different lately," she said, her voice cautious, hesitant. We were in the kitchen, a rare moment of occupying the same space without actively avoiding eye contact. "Yeah," I replied simply, not offering more than that, not feeling the need to explain or justify. Are you okay?" she asked, and there was a vulnerability in her tone, a genuine concern, that caught me off guard. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time since D-Day, Discovery Day, as I'd morbidly started calling it, I didn't feel that immediate, overwhelming pang of anger or betrayal. Instead, I felt a strange sort of acceptance. Not of what she did, but of the reality of our situation. "I'm getting there," I said, and it was the honest truth. "I'm figuring things out." She nodded slowly, her eyes searching mine for something. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe understanding. Maybe a sign that the oldest wasn't completely dead. But I didn't offer either. Not yet. I wasn't ready to decide what came next for us. I was still too busy figuring out what came next for me. As the weeks turned into months, I realized that the searing pain of betrayal doesn't just magically disappear. It lingers, like a scar that, even when healed, still reminds you of the wound you've endured. But scars also tell a story of survival, of growth, of strength you didn't know you possessed. I still didn't know what the future held for Laura and me. Maybe we'd find a way back to each other, navigating the treacherous path of rebuilding trust. Or maybe we wouldn't. Maybe the damage was too extensive, the chasm too wide to bridge. But for the first time in a long, long time, I wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. I wasn't clinging desperately to the past, or trying to control an outcome I had no power over. I was just living, one day at a time, one punch, one page, one conversation at a time. And that, I realized, with a quiet sense of dawning peace, was enough. It had to be. The fallout from that night, from the whole sordid affair, didn't just end with my tentative steps towards self-discovery or my newfound focus on personal growth. No, life, it seems, has a rather persistent way of ensuring that unfinished business, loose ends, eventually find their way back to you, especially when someone as carelessly destructive as Brent was involved. I wasn't actively looking for revenge anymore. I felt I'd made my point, loud and clear, in that gym parking lot. My focus had shifted inward. But the universe, or perhaps just the mundane workings of local law enforcement, wasn't quite done with him. It started with an unexpected phone call. I was at work, immersed in a spreadsheet, trying to decipher some particularly convoluted figures, when my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, local but not one I recognized. Something, a prickle of intuition, told me to answer. "Hello." The voice on the other end was female, calm yet firm, professional. "Is this Mr. Turner?" "Yes," I replied, a slight frown creasing my brow. "Who's asking?" "This is Detective Harris with the local police department. We'd like to speak with you, if you have a moment, about an incident involving a Mr. Brent Coleman." My heart momentarily stopped, then kicked into a nervous rhythm. My first thought, a jolt of apprehension, was about the fight. Had Brent, despite his on-the-ground capitulation, decided to press charges after all? Part of me wanted to laugh at the sheer irony. Him, the aggressor in so many ways, running to the cops after his bravado had been so thoroughly dismantled. But I also knew this could get serious, legally messy. What about him? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, neutral. Mr. Coleman has been involved in several complaints recently, Mr. Turner, Detective Harris continued, her tone even. It seems he's been crossing professional boundaries with a number of his female clients, and we're conducting an investigation into allegations of harassment and, in some cases, potential misconduct of a more serious nature. We understand from various sources that there may have been an altercation between you two recently. Would you mind coming down to the station to provide a statement? Anything you could share might be helpful. The news hit me like a tidal wave, completely unexpected. Complaints, boundaries, harassment, serious misconduct. Brent wasn't just a smug, cheating trainer who had an affair with my wife. He was, potentially, a predator, systematically using his position of trust and authority to manipulate and exploit vulnerable people. The anger I'd felt during our parking lot confrontation resurfaced, but this time it wasn't just personal, it was righteous. It was for all the other women he might have targeted. I'll be there, I said, my voice tight. I hung up before I could second-guess myself. At the station, in a small, sterile interview room, I gave my statement. I told Detective Harris everything. The late-night texts Laura had received, the special sessions, the inappropriate intimacy I'd witnessed at the gym, the dinner date, and yes, the fight in the parking lot. Being as honest and factual as I could about my own actions as well. Detective Harris listened carefully, her expression unreadable, occasionally nodding as she jotted down notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with a mix of what I interpreted as sympathy and steely determination. You're not the first person to come forward with concerns about Mr. Coleman's behavior, Mr. Turner, she said quietly. It appears Mr. Brent has been exploiting his clients, leveraging his position, for quite a while now. Most of them, understandably, are too embarrassed, or perhaps too afraid of repercussions, to say anything officially. Your account, and your willingness to speak about the altercation, actually helps build a stronger, more comprehensive picture. Hearing that made me feel both vindicated and deeply disturbed. Brent hadn't just disrespected me and my marriage. He'd been preying on people, likely for years, hiding behind his carefully constructed facade of charm and sculpted muscles. The fallout for Brent came quickly and decisively after that. He was arrested a few weeks later. News of the investigation and his subsequent arrest spread like wildfire through the local community. His smug, grinning face was plastered all over the local news websites, accompanied by headlines that painted a very different, and far darker, picture of the man who had once thought he was untouchable, the beast of fitness. At first, I didn't know how to feel. A part of me, the wounded, vengeful part, wanted to celebrate, to revel in the public downfall, the justice being served. But another part of me, a quieter, more reflective part, felt the profound weight of it all. Brent's disgrace didn't magically erase what had happened between Laura and me. It didn't undo the betrayal, or instantly mend our broken marriage. It was just closure, of a sort. A very messy, very public kind of closure to one toxic chapter. Laura, for her part, was deeply shaken by the news, by the full extent of Brent's alleged depravities. I had no idea, she said one evening, her voice barely above a whisper, her face pale and drawn. We were sitting across from each other at the dining table, a rare shared meal of takeout pizza. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a mug of tea, as if for warmth, though the evening was mild. I don't know what I thought. I thought he was just attentive, charismatic. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. What could I say? That her poor judgment, her naivety, her desperate need for external validation had almost cost her everything, had dragged her into the orbit of a dangerous man? That her blind trust in someone like Brent had nearly destroyed us both? She already knew that. I could see it in the shame and self-reproach in her eyes. And I didn't see the point in rubbing salt in the already gaping wound. I'm so sorry, she said, after a long, difficult silence, her gaze finally meeting mine, raw and vulnerable. For everything. For him. For the lies. For what I did to us. For not seeing. It was the first truly unequivocal, comprehensive apology I'd heard from her, devoid of excuses or justifications. And it hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to hold on to my anger, to my righteousness, to use it as a shield against the persistent ache of hurt. But looking at her then, stripped of her defenses, so clearly devastated by the reality of who Brent truly was, I couldn't, not entirely. I appreciate that, Laura, I said finally, my voice softer than I intended. I really do. Sorry isn't a magic wand. We've got a long, long way to go if we're ever going to fix this. If it can even be fixed. She nodded, fresh tears glistening in her eyes. But this time, they felt different. They felt like tears of genuine remorse, of understanding. I know, she whispered. I know. And I'm willing to try. If you are. As Brent's trial approached, more sordid details of his actions came to light. The manipulation, the coercion, the way he preyed on his clients' insecurities and vulnerabilities, grooming them, isolating them. It was far worse, far more systemic than I'd initially imagined. Seeing him on the news, no longer smug but looking defeated and small as he was led away in handcuffs after a preliminary hearing, brought a grim sense of finality, but also a chilling reminder of how fragile trust can be, how easily it can be exploited. In the end, Brent got what he deserved. The gym fired him immediately upon his arrest, his reputation was in tatters, and he faced significant legal consequences for his actions, including a period of incarceration. But justice for him, such as it was, didn't erase the scars he'd left, on me, on Laura, and undoubtedly on the other people whose lives he'd damaged. Healing, for us, would take time, a lot of time, and I wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy, or even guaranteed. Still, there was a definitive sense of closure in knowing that that particular, poisonous chapter of my life was well and truly over. Brent was no longer a looming, shadowy figure in my mind, no longer a tangible threat to my peace or my future. And as I stood in my home, the home Laura and I were tentatively, painstakingly trying to rebuild, looking at the life I was slowly, cautiously piecing back together, I realized something important. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about reclaiming your own sense of worth, your own narrative, your own future. And that's exactly what I plan to do, one day, one step at a time. Laura and I didn't magically reconcile overnight after Brent's downfall and her apology. It wasn't a Hollywood movie where one heartfelt speech and a few tears fixed years of accumulating cracks and a monumental betrayal. We had a lot of hard conversations ahead of us, conversations filled with more tears, uncomfortable silences, and painful honesty. She admitted to the mistakes she'd made, the full extent of her choices, without trying to minimize or excuse them anymore. But she also, haltingly, told me about the profound loneliness she'd felt in the year leading up to it, the growing disconnect between us that neither of us had properly acknowledged or addressed until it was far too late. Until she'd sought validation in the worst possible place. It wasn't easy to hear, her side of things. My instinct was still to be defensive, to point out my own hurts. But I listened. For the first time, really listened, without interrupting, without formulating my rebuttal. And in her faltering words, I found something I hadn't expected, a sliver of understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, that felt like a distant shore. But a dim realization that we'd both, in our own ways, let our marriage drift, let communication falter, let the everyday stresses of life erode the foundations we'd once thought so strong. She had made the catastrophic mistake, the one that shattered everything, but the path to that mistake had been paved, in part, by a shared neglect. We decided to try. To really try. Not to go back to what we were. That was impossible. That couple was gone forever. But to see if we could build something new, something on the ruins, something potentially stronger for having survived the storm. We started therapy, both individually and as a couple. It was brutal at times, dredging up old resentments, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and each other. There were sessions where we left angrier and more distant than when we went in. But we kept going back. We took it slow. Incredibly slow. For a while, I even moved into a small, furnished apartment across town, giving us both the space to breathe, to reflect, to exist independently without the constant pressure of each other's presence and the ghosts in our house. It was lonely, those first few weeks on my own, the silence of the apartment amplifying my own internal turmoil. But it also gave me a chance to solidify the rediscovery of myself that had begun in the boxing gym and with my old friends. I learned to cook more than just scrambled eggs. I read voraciously. I explored parts of the city I'd never seen. I learned to be okay with my own company. Laura and I started dating again, in a strange, tentative way. We'd meet for coffee, then eventually, for quiet dinners in neutral, public places. We talked, really talked, about things we hadn't discussed in years. Our fears, our dreams, both individual and shared, our regrets, the small joys, the lingering pains. It wasn't always perfect. There were moments when the weight of the past felt too heavy, when an innocent comment would trigger a painful memory, when the urge to retreat back into anger and suspicion was almost overwhelming. But we kept trying. We learned to communicate differently, more openly, more vulnerably. Eventually, after many months, I realized that I didn't hate her anymore. I couldn't. She had hurt me more deeply than I ever thought possible, yes. But underneath all that pain, she was still the woman I had loved for so long, the woman who had, once upon a time, lit up my entire life. Forgiveness didn't arrive in a sudden epiphany, but it started to take root, a fragile seedling, growing slowly with each honest conversation, each shared moment of vulnerability, each small act of rebuilding. By the time I moved back home, nearly a year after the initial confrontation, it wasn't the same house I'd left. It felt different, lighter somehow, as if we'd managed to clear out some of the ghosts that had been haunting its hallways. We weren't the same people we'd been before, and maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. We were more scarred, certainly, but also, perhaps, a little wiser, more acutely aware of what it truly took to make a marriage work, and how easily it could be destroyed by neglect, by secrets, by looking for answers outside instead of within. Life didn't magically go back to normal. There was no normal to return to. Instead, it moved forward, step by cautious step, into something new, something different, something that felt, surprisingly, like hope. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt genuinely hopeful, not just for us, but for myself. Because I learned that no matter how broken things seem, no matter how deep the betrayal, there's always a chance to rebuild, to find a new path, if you're willing to do the hard, painful, necessary work. And we were, together, and separately. And that, I was beginning to understand, was the key.